Frank Zane has never been reluctant to speak when he believes something important is being lost. And when he looks at today's top-level bodybuilders, he doesn't see athletes, art, or sport. He sees what he describes, with the precision of the former chemistry teacher he once was, as an assembly line. And what that assembly line is producing, he says, is undermining everything the sport was meant to represent. To understand why Zane is so critical of where bodybuilding has gone, you need to understand how he approached building a physique, because his method was distinct from nearly everyone else in the sport. While other bodybuilders stepped on scales and tracked body weight, Frank Zane took photographs, thousands of them, tens of thousands of color slides over the course of his career. While competitors chased numbers, body weight, lifting totals, arm measurements, Zane was pursuing a visual standard. He never had his body fat measured. He never tracked specific measurements. When people asked for his stats, he said he'd never taken them, because judges didn't weigh you on a scale. They judged what you looked like, so that's what he focused on. The approach sounds straightforward. It wasn't. Zane was training his eye alongside his body. He'd take a photo, study it, identify what needed work, and build a training program around the weakest visual element. If a muscle wasn't showing sufficient separation from a given angle, he'd isolate it differently. If a pose wasn't landing correctly, he'd spend as much time in front of a mirror practicing posing as he did under the bar. He considered posing as important as lifting, and with good reason, since a well-developed muscle that can't be effectively displayed is invisible to a judge. His training was structured around a 3-day split: back and biceps on one day, legs on the next, chest, shoulders, and triceps on the third. High volume, moderate weight, strict form, and meticulous isolation. He performed deadlifts from blocks to develop upper back thickness without thickening his waistline. He favored incline bench press over flat, because shape mattered more to him than pressing power. He avoided movements that would add mass to his midsection and interfere with his vacuum pose, the most visually striking element of his physique, the ability to draw his already narrow waist down to proportions that appeared nearly impossible while maintaining full muscular control. He was, in the most literal sense, a student of the body. He held a Bachelor of Science degree and later earned a Master's in Experimental Psychology. He approached bodybuilding the way a scientist approaches a research problem, through observation, hypothesis, and a willingness to revise when results didn't support the method. He incorporated powerlifting techniques after noticing that lifters like Doug Young were developing back thickness through slow eccentrics that conventional bodybuilding methods weren't producing. He meditated and used visualization, drawing on Zen Buddhist practices to sharpen his mental focus in the gym years before the fitness world adopted the language of mindfulness. Through all of it, the photographs, the precise isolation work, the psychological preparation, the philosophical framework, he was pursuing a single objective: not the largest physique on stage, but the most proportional one. 3 Mr. Olympia titles, a career spanning more than 2 decades, and a physique that remains a reference point today for what the human body can achieve when developed with precision rather than mass alone. That is the standard against which he measures what bodybuilding has become, and when he looks at the modern Mr. Olympia stage, he does not see what he built his career around. The shift from aesthetics to mass was gradual at first, then accelerating, then total. It can be traced through a few pivotal moments in the sport's history, and Frank Zane was watching each one with increasing unease. The first significant turn came after Zane's own reign ended. The early 1980s brought new competitors pushing the limits of what a human body could weigh, while still arriving in reasonable condition. Zane himself felt that pressure. Joe Weider, the most powerful figure in bodybuilding at the time, urged him repeatedly to add mass. Zane followed that advice for the 1982 Olympia. He came in heavier than his natural best. He placed second. He has since said that had he trusted his instincts, come in lighter, sharper, truer to his aesthetic ideal, he might have won. Whether the numbers support that is uncertain, but the conclusion he drew from it is telling. The sport was already beginning to value size over shape. Dorian Yates stepped on stage in 1992. Ronnie Coleman arrived not long after. By the time Coleman was dominating the Olympia in the late 1990s and early 2000s, competitors were regularly appearing at 270, 290, 300 pounds. The conversation had moved away from whether a physique was beautiful and toward whether it was the biggest, the most extreme, the most overwhelming in scale. The term mass monster became a compliment. A generation of bodybuilders raised on Coleman's 8 Olympia titles entered the sport with one objective: get as large as humanly possible. Zane's response to this trajectory goes to the center of what changed. He described bodybuilding as once being about creation, developing a body, shaping it, making it reflect a deliberate vision. That process was the point. What he saw happening as the sport moved toward mass looked more like industrial production. In his words, it's overdone, it's mass-produced, it's like an assembly line. Just crank out those machines and they all look the same. During the golden era, competitors could be identified by their physiques alone. Arnold Schwarzenegger had a particular combination of mass and symmetry that no one else possessed. Zane had his vacuum and his V-taper. Franco Columbu was compact and dense. Robbie Robinson had his lines. Each physique reflected something individual, a set of values, a vision of what a body should look like. They were distinct from one another. That distinctiveness is harder to find in a modern men's Open Olympia lineup. What tends to appear is variation on a single theme. Enormous, striated condition to the extreme, with similar proportions and similar presentations. The physiques are impressive, but they are not particularly individual. That loss of individuality is what Zane is describing when he uses the phrase assembly line. He has also noted something that judging criteria state clearly, but that competitive outcomes often contradict. Athletes are not weighed on stage. Body weight carries no official influence on scoring. And yet, as Zane observed, bodybuilders post their off-season weight on social media and draw significant attention for it. Announcing a gain of 30 pounds since the previous season is treated as progress by default. The culture, fans, social media, the mythology surrounding mass, rewards a metric that does not officially count. In chasing that metric, Zane argues, competitors are sacrificing qualities that do. In Frank Zane's era, the image would have been inconceivable. A competitor who has spent years developing every muscle group with meticulous precision, dieting to single-digit body fat, building legs, arms, and a back of exceptional density, walking on stage with a stomach so severely distended it protrudes beyond the chest. That is what bodybuilding audiences have watched happen, repeatedly, at the sport's highest competitive levels. It is not coincidence, it is consequence. The condition is known in bodybuilding circles as Palumboism, also referred to as bubble gut, HGH gut, or steroid gut. The name derives from Dave Palumbo, a bodybuilder active in the 1990s who was among the first competitors to visibly display it and who was later charged with distributing illegal substances, including human growth hormone. The gut itself is not fat. It is not simple bloating. It is the physiological result of subjecting the human body to superphysiological doses of human growth hormone and insulin over extended periods. Human growth hormone, in the doses used by elite bodybuilders, sometimes reaching 20 international units per day. More than 4 times what the average young adult produces naturally during peak deep sleep, does not selectively stimulate muscle growth. It stimulates the growth of everything, including internal organs. The intestines can expand, the liver can enlarge, the stomach muscles themselves hypertrophy. When all of this occurs simultaneously, while subcutaneous fat has been dieted to near zero, the result is the protrusion visible on stage. The gut. The condition that competitors at the absolute peak of physical conditioning must stand on stage with. Insulin abuse compounds the problem through a separate mechanism. Bodybuilders began using exogenous insulin in significant quantities because it is a powerful driver of nutrient uptake. It forces amino acids and glucose into muscle cells at an accelerated rate, theoretically enhancing muscle growth and recovery. But insulin does not distinguish between targeted muscle groups and the visceral fat behind the abdominal wall. It drives nutrients and fat storage into the omentum, the fatty tissue behind the stomach, creating additional protrusion. Combined with HGH and the caloric demands of maintaining 280 or more pounds of muscle mass, the result is a physique that appears from the waist up as though 2 entirely different bodies have been joined at the midsection. A 2024 study published in medical literature confirmed what bodybuilding insiders had long maintained. Prolonged use of high-dose HGH and insulin are central contributors to Palumboism. Visceral fat accumulation, organ enlargement, and altered tissue structure all play a role. Some of these changes may be irreversible. Organs that enlarge due to HGH do not necessarily return to their original size when use stops. Bone structure changes over time. The hands, feet, and facial features of long-time HGH users often change visibly. These are structural alterations to the human body, not incidental side effects. Frank Zane never developed Palumboism. His waist, throughout his competitive career, was among the smallest in the sport's history. He built the second tightest midsection ever measured on a Mr. Olympia competitor. His approach reflected a fundamental principle of classical physique assessment. The waist is the fulcrum of the entire physique. A narrow waist amplifies shoulder width, deepens the V-taper, and heightens the visual impact of every surrounding muscle group. When the waist expands, when it distends and protrudes, the overall architecture that makes a physique visually coherent is lost. The bodybuilders who developed Palumboism were, by most measures, among the most muscularly developed athletes in the sport's history. The substances used to push their physiques beyond natural limits produced, as a direct consequence, the most visually damaging condition the sport has seen, displayed on stage under competition lighting, in front of live audiences. The same tools used to build the physique degraded the physique in a way that no amount of muscle mass could offset. Bubble gut, alarming as it looks, is not the most serious consequence of what has been happening in competitive bodybuilding. The most serious consequence is death. And the data on that is now well established. A major study tracking over 20,000 athletes who competed in IFBB bodybuilding events between 2005 and 2020 identified 121 deaths during the monitored period. Of those, 73 were classified as sudden deaths, and 46 were categorized as sudden cardiac deaths. 11 of those cardiac deaths were among currently competing athletes, with an average age at death of 34.7 years. These were not aging veterans whose bodies had worn down over decades. These were active competitors, men in their physical prime dying of heart failure in their mid-30s. The risk does not affect amateur and professional competitors equally. Professionals, the athletes at the top of the sport, competing at the highest levels with the most extreme physiques, faced a hazard ratio for sudden cardiac death more than 5 times that of amateurs. The better an athlete performs within elite competitive bodybuilding, as the sport currently defines performance, the greater the likelihood of dying suddenly from heart failure. The physiological mechanisms behind this are well documented. Anabolic steroids increase the size and wall thickness of the heart muscle, specifically the left ventricle, which is responsible for pumping blood to the entire body. When that wall thickens beyond a certain point, the heart's ability to fill and pump properly becomes compromised. This condition, known as left ventricular hypertrophy, substantially increases the risk of arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats that can become fatal without warning. The same steroids contributing to that structural change are also elevating LDL cholesterol, lowering HDL cholesterol, raising blood pressure, and increasing the blood's tendency to clot. That is not one cardiovascular risk factor operating in isolation. It is 5 affecting the same organ simultaneously over years of consistent use. Diuretics, commonly used by competitors in the final days before a competition to reduce subcutaneous water retention and sharpen muscular definition, introduce additional electrolyte imbalances capable of triggering arrhythmias in hearts that are already structurally compromised. The sport has produced some of the most medically dangerous bodies ever deliberately created. And unlike combat sports where physical risk is visible and immediate, in bodybuilding the danger is internal. It accumulates quietly, over years, with little outward indication until it becomes acute. Dallas McCarver was 26 years old when he died in 2017. Boston Lloyd, who was openly candid about using his own body to test various substances, died in 2022 at 29. In November 2024, a retired bodybuilder named Jose Mateus Correa Silva collapsed during a workout in Brazil. He was 28 years old. Bystanders brought him to a local fire station, where more than an hour of CPR failed to revive him. His brother issued a statement saying he had no prior health conditions. Independent researchers placed these figures in broader context. Professional bodybuilders were found to be dying at roughly 1.75 times the rate of former NFL players in comparable age brackets, a sport widely understood to carry serious physical risk. They were dying at nearly 2.5 times the rate of former Major League Baseball players. A sport whose public image is built on physical health and conditioning is operating with mortality statistics that, applied transparently to any other athletic enterprise, would likely prompt significant institutional response. Frank Zane has addressed this for years, not through public statements made for effect, but in the measured way of someone who taught chemistry and understands what happens when incompatible substances are introduced into a system under sustained pressure. He has said that the focus on rapid mass accumulation rather than gradual and deliberate muscle development underlies much of the problem. He has described watching the culture shift toward an approach he considers both physiologically counterproductive and medically reckless. He has noted that muscle built through extreme pharmacological acceleration does not produce the same quality of result as muscle developed over time, not the same shape, the same density, or the same visual effect on a well-proportioned frame. The athletes who are dying did not fail at what they were pursuing. They succeeded at the version of bodybuilding the modern era trained them to pursue. One of Frank Zane's most persistent criticisms of modern bodybuilding is its obsession with quantification in the wrong places. He has spent decades making a single argument that sounds simple but turns out to be philosophically significant. Numbers don't matter if they don't show up in the mirror. When bodybuilders in today's sport want to demonstrate progress, they post their weight. 300 pounds. 310. They announce how much they've gained since the previous off-season as though it were a stock price trending upward. Fans respond with enthusiasm. The mythology of mass has effectively turned the scale into the sport's unofficial primary judge, even though the actual judges never see one. Zane has pointed out this contradiction consistently. Competitors are judged on how they look, only on how they look. So why is body weight the number everyone fixates on? He learned this through his own career. Before the 1982 Olympia, with Joe Weider pressuring him to add size, Zane relented and came in heavier. He placed second. He has reflected on that competition many times since, and concluded that had he ignored the pressure and arrived at his natural aesthetic peak, a few pounds lighter, tighter, more himself, he might have won. What let him down was not his physique, but his willingness to let someone else's theory about size override his own photographic evidence of what his body looked like at its best. That experience shaped how he coached. At his training programs, first Zane Haven in Palm Springs in the 1980s, now the Zane Experience, the first thing he does with a new client is take photographs, not measurements, not body fat scans, photographs, because a photograph shows what a person actually looks like, not what a number suggests they should look like. From that image the work begins, identifying what needs development, what needs refinement, what's already working. The training is oriented toward the image, not the statistic. This approach is notably at odds with a sport that has become increasingly focused on trackable data. Bodybuilding in the social media era has produced an environment where metrics function as performance in themselves: competition weight, off-season lifts, follower counts, weekly check-in posts. In many cases, the actual objective of achieving a specific physical appearance has been displaced by the performance of pursuing it. People are building bodies for content rather than competition, and in that environment, a scale number is far easier to post than a nuanced assessment of whether proportions have genuinely improved. Zane is also deeply skeptical of the bulking philosophy that modern bodybuilding has largely inherited from the mass monster era. He has written about the subject with the directness of a former chemistry teacher who has watched the same experiment fail repeatedly. Quality muscle, he argues, takes time to build. Real proportioned muscle that changes the visual architecture of the body accumulates at perhaps 5 pounds a year when developed correctly, not 50 pounds in an off-season, not 30 pounds through aggressive bulking. When a competitor gains 30 or 40 pounds rapidly, the scale increases, but what's actually being added is a mixture of muscle, fat, and water retention. The months that follow are spent dieting back to competitive condition, and at the end of that process, many athletes find themselves roughly where they started, a year older, with a midsection that has been repeatedly stretched, and a cardiovascular system that has absorbed another year of extreme drug use. Zane's assessment is direct. The time has been wasted, the health risks were real, and the physique likely hasn't improved. The sport rewards the appearance of size and the theater of mass. It does not consistently reward the patient, methodical, image-driven approach to building something genuinely refined. That gap between what gets celebrated and what actually produces excellence is, in Zane's view, one of the central structural failures of modern competitive bodybuilding. Frank Zane remains an active presence in bodybuilding. At 82, he still competes in natural and masters divisions, coaches clients through the Zane experience, writes, publishes, and appears at industry events. He is not a detached critic. He is someone who continues to engage with the sport and, by his own account, is troubled by much of what he sees. His concerns are several. He has been vocal for years about the size problem in elite competition. He views the bubble gut, the distended midsection now common among top competitors, as both an aesthetic and a medical failure. He has also pointed to what he calls an assembly line quality in modern physiques, a uniformity that makes individual competitors difficult to distinguish from one another. But running beneath all of these concerns is something he returns to consistently: the shortcut mentality. When asked what advice he would give to young bodybuilders today, his answer has been consistent. He emphasizes patience. He stresses that building a physique capable of lasting, one that holds up over decades, and doesn't depend entirely on pharmaceutical support, is a slow process that cannot be rushed without consequences. The consequences, he implies, are visible across the sport, in the distended midsections, in the cardiac deaths, in the uniform physiques that dominate the professional stage.